the Israeli attack going on. It's been coming right over the top of us.
We are in the phase of the mopping up operation that will be continued until we'll clean this area.
What you're saying is that there's only one way to deal with the PLO, which is to eradicate them by force.
Well, I don't think that any deal with the PLO is possible. They should disappear as an element in the political game in the Middle East.
If Israel tries to destroy all the buildings, it will find under one stone a soldier to destroy Israel.
Kiryat Shimona is one of a score of northern Israeli communities that live in the shadow of the South Lebanon hills. Its many bomb-proof shelters will be full tonight. Its children today were being trained what to do in a bombardment, because the town's within range of the big guns of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organisation. And the Israeli army is ready too. One valley we saw was bristling with Israeli tanks and mobile cannon, their guns facing north. An advance force, according to American intelligence sources, has been poised for an invasion of southern Lebanon for 2 weeks now. Those same sources say that there are 2 armoured divisions in the area, with a total of 40,000 men. Any PLO retaliation for yesterday's Israeli air raid is likely to be enough to push the button. The more hawkish members of the cabinet, led by the defence minister, have been pressing for 3 months for a massive invasion of the Lebanon to crush the PLO's strongholds there once and for all. The plan would not be for a limited operation, but for one which might go all the way to Beirut and could involve a substantial risk of war with Syria.
The gunman had his weapon set on single shot when he stepped out of the late-night crowds on London's Park Lane and fired deliberately into the ambassador's head. Had it been on automatic, say police, there could have been something closely resembling a massacre. But within seconds, men of the Diplomatic Protection Squad chased, shot and wounded the gunman only a few yards away from where the ambassador lay. Hit in the head, the gunman was rushed by ambulance to the same hospital to which his victim had been taken. At that time, it wasn't clear how many men were involved, as Mr. Gilbert Kelland, who was at the dinner with the ambassador, said.
When the man who was shot, the man who's thought possibly to have been involved, had he fired back at the protection officer?
He had not.
So it was. What kind of weapon do we know did he use on the ambassador? We've had reports of submachine guns.
It was a type of machine gun. What exactly? Again, I'm not sure, but it was a type of machine.
And was one man or more than one man involved?
One man pursued by the protection officer. Whether there was more than, there probably was more than one, but.
Early this morning, police constables Ian Richard on the right and Clive Blake halted a car south of the River Thames, detaining 2 men and taking possession of at least 1 weapon. Later today, a 4th man was detained and more arms found in the Weybridge area of Surrey. Ambassador Argov was rushed to one of the top neurosurgical hospitals in the world, where he underwent an operation of several hours to relieve dangerous brain pressure as a result of his head injuries. His condition today was said to be stable, but with a note of warning.
We must emphasise that the ambassador is still critically ill, and at this stage we cannot predict what the outcome will be.
Scotland Yard said tonight it deplored what it called this cruel crime, but added that with the 4 arrests, it believed it had frustrated a series of planned terrorist outrages. Ray Maloney, News at 10 at the National Hospital in London.
Keep rolling.
The Israelis are tightening their grip on Beirut all the time, by sea and by land. They're only a few miles behind me now at Demor. And only 15 minutes ago, 5 planes came in and dropped bombs on this spot, very close to the center of Beirut, leaving this damage. It is these sort of raids which are driving the defenders of this city into ever tighter defense rings around it. In this single bombing run, just 1 man was killed and 2 were injured. Gun emplacements, anti-aircraft guns, and a mobile radar van were destroyed. Just a few of the many which are now being set up, covering every approach.
Minutes after midday, the Israeli Defense Forces announced, "Our guns have gone silent on all fronts." And for the first time in 5 days, the soldiers relaxed. The Israelis called the ceasefire without agreement with their enemies. And within minutes, news came in, the Syrians would observe it too. The Israelis called a halt under intense pressure from the Americans. But the lines are now drawn with Israel in a strong position. The Israeli planes that returned to base as the ceasefire came in had, say the Israelis, shot down 18 more Syrian MiGs. So in all, a third of the combat strength of Syria's air force has been destroyed. Israeli losses include over 100 men killed. And there was a massive funeral this afternoon, attended by government and military leaders. They were burying General Yakutiel Adam, a former second-in-command of the army. He was killed yesterday in a PLO ambush. The defense minister made it clear that operations against Palestinian guerrillas inside the captured territory will go on.
We are in the phase of the mopping up operation, cleaning operation. That is nothing to do with the ceasefire. That will be continued until we'll clean this area.
It's this part of the war which has brought catastrophe on hundreds of thousands of civilians. The PLO were using their towns and villages as fire bases, so the Israelis bombed and shelled them. Inevitably, not just the fighters were killed. Even hospitals were cleared of patients in the search for guerrillas. And the destruction has left thousands homeless. Food and water has been scarce now for 5 days. The Israelis will stay put until terms for a withdrawal are negotiated. That may take months, a long time to test the ceasefire. Derek Taylor, News at 10, Israel.
The Israeli airstrikes went on right through this morning, some of the targets in Beirut itself. And the fight back went on as well. It was a very jittery morning, people straining their eyes into the bright sky, but the attacking jets high above were hard to see. It was jittery because the bombing has been getting closer and closer all week, with constant air attacks like this one yesterday evening just south of here, where the smoke of explosions billowed up around the hills around the PLO stronghold at Kaldi. It was here we were caught in a series of bombing runs and hurled ourselves into a trench with a PLO unit. The first bombs came almost immediately and very close. Unseen, the attacking jets circled and came in again. Armed only with rifles, the men we were with could only wait. Just in the background, you can hear the Israeli attack going on. It's been coming right over the top of us with the bombs exploding just outside this trench where we're crouched down with a unit of the army here. The Israelis have been attacking like this by air sporadically all day, on and off on these positions, only about 5 or 10 minutes drive from the center of Beirut, and they're still up there. There's another strike gone in. It's just a little bit further away from us now. They seem to be moving down the coast a little bit, more towards the center of Haldi, which is only a short distance away from us. And then, as the bombing moved away, we ran for it. Our car was on fire, our driver dead. It's been endless raids like these that have kept the streets of Beirut deserted. It's noon now in this city, and for the first time in 6 days, it's quiet, strangely quiet. There's no gunfire. It's been going on all around us all day, heavy bombing, heavy anti-aircraft fire everywhere, but now it's suddenly quiet. But whether the ceasefire holds in this faction-ridden part of the world, nobody yet knows. There are many, many different factions in this country, and any of them could decide to go it alone and start the whole round all over again. But for the moment, it's quiet. And now a soldier waiting on the sea front for the rumored Israeli invasion could relax.
The Israelis say the ceasefire with the Syrians is in force and holding, and Israeli troops throughout most of the 1,100 square miles of Lebanon they've occupied have been engaged in searching out any remaining PLO guerrillas. This is Nabatea, which was the main PLO stronghold in the south. The Israelis had shelled the town, then entered to clear out those guerrillas prepared to fight. These PLO men surrendered. They'll now be moved into Israel for imprisonment. The defense minister said yesterday that this kind of mopping up operation, he called it, would continue unaffected by the ceasefire. But in fact, although the Israeli front line appears to be holding steady, it's now clear there's no ceasefire with the Palestinian forces. They said they'd observe it only if the Israelis pulled out of Lebanon immediately. So what in effect the Israelis did by their ceasefire declaration yesterday was to detach Syrian support from the PLO. Now the Israelis are completing the military operation against the guerrillas unhindered. Derek Taylor, ITN, Israel.
In Beirut, Israeli jets are again flying over the city. We can see them high up there in the sky. They're dropping their heat-seeking deflectors so that the missiles fired at them won't get at them. And they leave little trails in the sky. You might just be able to hear in the background the anti-aircraft fire against them. There we are. We can't quite see the planes, but we can see the trails that they've left. So this very uneasy truce seems to be breaking up already. We can't hear any bombs falling at the moment, but the anti-aircraft fire is there.
President Reagan's special envoy, Mr. Philip Habib, has already begun the laborious task of working out terms for an Israeli withdrawal. After his meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Begin, he'll be in Syria later today. But his diplomatic effort is being opened while fighting between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organisation, approaches a climax. This morning, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Mr. Shamir, described the action as Israel mopping up PLO resistance. Israeli troops have now cut off Beirut entirely, and their guns are directed against the PLO headquarters in the city. After the failed attempt at a ceasefire between the two forces, it looks as though the Israelis are preparing to strike the PLO at its heart and crush it. But the ceasefire between Israel and Syria is holding. The battlefields around the Bekaa Valley are now graveyards for knocked-out Soviet-made Syrian tanks and for their crews. The Israelis are now even redeploying some of their armoured units away from this front. A permanent pullout of all Israeli forces, though, is still a long way off. The terms demanded by Israel involve a zone stretching 25 miles north of its border to be kept clear of the PLO. The negotiators' biggest headache is going to be finding an international police force to guarantee that. It's thought unlikely that the United Nations will agree to act as peacekeepers here, and the solution that's being sought is the setting up of some kind of multinational force, with the Americans playing a big part. But that may take months to negotiate, and the Israelis are going to take a tough line to get their security guarantees. Derek Taylor, News at 1, Southern Lebanon.
They said they didn't want to take Beirut unless they had to, but they came. 2 ceasefires had come and gone, blown away by the continuing battles between these troops and the Palestinians. These are the Israelis who had smashed the PLO defenses to the south and east of the city, and then, under cover of darkness last night, moved on. Now, in the light of this Monday morning, we were the first to see them as they rumbled into the very suburbs of Beirut. They've ignored all calls to stop fighting. They've brushed aside all appeals to halt their advance. For over a week, they've moved steadily forwards, and this is now a quite extraordinary sight to see them here. On this side of Lebanon, the people are bitter about the Palestinians, who feel they've brought such devastation and killing to their country, and they hope this Israeli invasion will remove what they see as this festering Palestinian sore. This is the Christian sector. Shalom, the people called out, which is not a greeting usually heard here. They welcome the troops as an army of liberation. Who are you actually fighting against? You know, Syrians, PLO?
Both.
Both of them?
Both. In small numbers, yeah.
Which gave you the harder time?
None of them gave us a hard time.
Do you have many casualties?
No, it's all relative. For us, it's a lot. It's a lot for us.
How many in your unit, do you know?
I don't want to give numbers, but my unit wasn't that badly hit. My unit was been all right.
The Palestinians in this capital city of Lebanon are now totally surrounded and cut off from the outside world. That's what these Israeli troops wanted, and that's what they've achieved here today. We don't know yet whether they'll physically move on to engage what's left of the PLO defenses, or whether they'll sit tight and negotiate from what is now a very strong position. Desmond Hamill, News at 10 with Israeli troops in Beirut. There are still small battles going on in more places than one around the outskirts of Beirut today. One of them is here at Souk El Khab. The local people told us that 2 days ago, some 400 Iranian commandos moved in here after a journey through Iraq and Syria. Israeli columns move on through Shwaifet, where the Syrians were only a short time ago, and which lies in the valley below. It's a very confusing situation, with so many different troops and militia scattered all over these hills. But whoever was engaging this hilltop village this morning was doing it with some effect. And still, the Israelis bring in their men. The sign in Hebrew says, "This way for heavy tanks," and the road leads to the airport. From the commanding heights above it, the Israelis control it, and no planes fly in or out. And off the coast, by day and night, their warships patrol, guarding all approaches to and all exits from this place. Desmond Hamill, News at 10, Beirut.
This was a crisis meeting in America's relations with Israel, and Mr. Begin was being bluntly warned about his country's actions in Lebanon. Later, Mr. Begin's appearance at the United Nations was applauded by some, but Arab delegates conspicuously walked out of the General Assembly. Mr. Begin's speech to the almost deserted chamber was a discursive historical justification of Israel's actions. Lebanon was never mentioned.
Self-defense is a most sacred right and duty of man. As long as tyranny is armed, liberty must have and develop weapons for its defense.
1 block away, the Israeli mission was kept under a virtual state of siege by PLO demonstrators. Mr. Begin has come to the United States with a resolute defense of his country's policies, and although he's had to listen to some tough talking from Secretary of State Haig, nothing very much has changed. America's policy retains that extraordinary tangle of objectives to maintain its commitment to Israel while working with friendly Arab nations to secure a lasting peace in the Middle East. Trevor McDonald, ITN, New York.
Where's the... We have another 2 minutes. Okay, I'm ready.
Mettiamo l'ultimo
To the east is the main Syrian force, and then on the other side, in the west, are trapped 6,000 PLO and an estimated 1,000 Syrian soldiers.
Allemand.
Speak English? Parlez-vous français? Monsieur. The PLO have started talking now about negotiations, but they're still insisting that the Israelis should withdraw first. But the Israelis and their Christian allies are in an overwhelmingly superior position, and it's they who will dictate the terms. Once, of course, the fighting has stopped. Derek Taylor, News at 1, with the Israeli forces in East Beirut.
No, I don't know whether we'll go into Beirut. I don't even think that it is absolutely necessary, but I am convinced that it is necessary to have the PLO leadership and military branch disappear if we wish to have a peaceful Middle East and the continuation of the peace process.
The consequence of what you're saying is that there's only one way to deal with the PLO, which is to eradicate them by force.
Well, I don't think that any deal with the PLO is possible. I don't think so.
So they must be crushed militarily then? That's the consequence of what you're saying, isn't it?
The consequence, or the logical consequence, is that they should disappear as an element in the political game in the Middle East.
Will Israel ever negotiate with them?
I don't think so. We can't do it. We can't do it, first of all, because we know them. And we know them much better than anybody else, because they were trying to fight us. And secondly, I don't think that they represent the Palestinians. I think that those Palestinians who live with us and who know us wish to live quietly, peacefully. And they have actually been terrorized for years by the people of the PLO. And time will come, and I hope that it will come, that they will be able to just to respire without or being freed of the terror of the PLO.
When will Israel withdraw from the Lebanon?
I can only tell you that we would like to withdraw yesterday. This is our real wish, to be able and stay in Lebanon as short as possible as an occupying force, I mean. I would love to be able to go there as a tourist, as a visitor, and all Israelis would like to do the same. But to withdraw our army as quickly as possible, provided that we get satisfactory arrangements, guarantees, and...
What are those guarantees? What are the minimum guarantees that Israel would accept and withdraw?
That Lebanon will not serve anymore as a basis for hostilities or hostile acts against the sovereign national territory of Israel. Nothing else, nothing more.
The Israelis have been moving more troops up to the outskirts of Beirut today and around the airport, sealing off the PLO in the west of the city. These are now their frontline positions in an area once controlled by the Syrians and the PLO. Well, this is Halde, or what's left of it, once a Palestinian stronghold. It's a place the Israeli jets bomb day after day, pounding it into rubble. But now they say there aren't any Palestinians here at all. The devastation here is severe, not only to buildings, but also to the shanty towns that have been wiped out, leaving little sign of the numbers of people who once lived here. These troops have set up roadblocks to check all movement up and down this coast road. As streams of refugees, white flags fluttering, try and leave the city, they're checked and filtered. And so are people moving up from the south. If the last-minute diplomatic and political negotiations fail to achieve a peaceful end to the PLO as a military force, the Israelis are now ready themselves to achieve it with their army. They are here and waiting. Desmond Hamill, News at 10 on the outskirts of Beirut.
In the affluent hills of East Beirut, there may be reminders of the fighting, but the residents are doing their best to forget it. A mile or two away, the shelling may be continuing, but here the only danger seems to be that the woman across the table may be wearing a more expensive outfit than you are. The Israeli soldiers can hardly believe they're sitting down to lunch in an Arab capital. And down the restaurant, an even more incredible sight. 6 junior ministers of Mr. Begin's government, who look as if they've come on a coach tour, not to inspect the front line in a war.
What does it feel like to be eating in a restaurant in Beirut?
I think it's a splendid view from one side, and I'm sure that the people here are welcoming us and are very happy that the Israelis arrived to rearrange things here and to fix a certain peace in the area.
Over the other side of the city is a different story. Rich and poor alike, they're fleeing for their lives. Some of these people have always lived in West Beirut. Others came here from the destruction in the south, only to find themselves in a situation potentially just as dangerous. It's a long wait at the checkpoint. It takes up to 48 hours of queuing to be searched and questioned by the Israelis.
For the past few days, the people of West Beirut have been pouring out of the city. Here to the south, they'll be joining up with thousands of others who haven't got a proper roof over their heads. The toll of suffering here is steadily mounting. David Walter, ITN, Southern Lebanon.
The ceasefire came only after the Israelis had established firm control of the mountains round Beirut. The Israelis made a massive bombardment of Syrian positions along the Beirut-Damascus highway. It had gone on night and day. Then came news that the Syrians had retreated, and the Israeli troops moved unopposed across the highway to the town of Jamor. They moved cautiously. No one knew if any Syrians or their PLO allies had stayed. But the only enemies the Israelis found were dead. As the Syrians fell back north, so the Israelis pursued. Another town fell, Araya this time, and the ceasefire came with the Israelis in an unchallenged position. But any truce between Israel and the PLO is by nature fragile, and if this one is seriously breached, the Israeli government will decide not whether to crush West Beirut, but how. There are two options. Either to go into West Beirut with armor and infantry, or to continue pounding the city by land, sea and air. And the argument in favor of this second option is that it would avoid the inevitable heavy Israeli casualties in street-to-street fighting. Derek Taylor, ITN, with the Israeli forces outside Beirut.
It's now become known as Beirut's longest day, and it was very long. This was certainly the heaviest Israeli attack on the city since the fighting started 3 weeks ago. The Phantoms had bombed it in the morning. Now they came over again, dropping decoys for heat-seeking missiles to mark this time the targets for the Israeli artillery in the hills and the naval guns offshore. The targets now, not just the Palestinian positions on the southern outskirts, but right into the western sector as well, among the high-rise apartments where the Lebanese people live and where, up to now, they have felt safe. Casualties are said to be very high, 250 dead and over 500 wounded. There's little doubt these figures will rise. In the late afternoon sun, this ferocious artillery and naval bombardment was producing casualties on one side only. The devastation in the west of the city is appalling, as might only be expected in such a densely populated and built-up area. Buildings smashed, windows blown out by the shock waves of huge explosions. And in the streets, the desperate race by rescue teams to reach the wounded and the dying, to search for those buried under the rubble. The hospitals filling up as those who could be found were brought in. Not just the fighting men, but again, as might be expected in an area like this, the non-combatants. When this longest day did end, the Israelis announced once again a ceasefire. They say it will be lasting and final. But the people still under this huge pall of smoke have heard that before. Desmond Hamill, ITN, Beirut.
The Israelis were moving tanks and heavy armor forward to seal off Beirut International Airport to the south of the besieged PLO in West Beirut. Then the shooting started. Rockets, mortars, and the big guns in action. It's not clear whether the Israelis or the PLO started it. At first, the Israeli cannon were targeted on the Palestinian camps just north of the airport. The spotters lined up the guns to try to take out the PLO fire bases there. The Israelis opened up intermittently from all around the hills to conceal their own positions. But the PLO shells started to fall more accurately, close round the Israeli positions. Israeli casualties were rushed back by field ambulance to waiting helicopters, from there to hospital in Israel. So then, for almost an hour, Israeli artillery punched out a warning further north, sowing a trail of destruction across the southwestern outskirts of the city. The Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces has talked about the use of military means to increase the political pressure on the PLO in West Beirut. But what's happening here now with these artillery exchanges is increasing tension and means that an all-out Israeli assault on West Beirut is more likely. Derek Taylor, News at 1, with the Israeli forces outside Beirut.
The Israelis are now visibly tightening their grip on West Beirut and engaging PLO positions which lie along the airport and across the southern edge of the city. Their armor has probed forward to new positions in front of the sprawling PLO camps. And high in the hills, more tanks and artillery are placed to fire directly down on the 5,000 to 6,000 PLO fighters who are trapped between them and the sea. It now seems that the extra time granted by the Israeli cabinet for negotiations to continue will go hand in hand with what they see as limited military operations designed to pressure the PLO into leaving the Lebanon on Israeli terms, that is, leaving the country completely. With tanks, artillery, the Israelis hammered the PLO. Only sometimes did we hear return fire. Another Israeli target was around a mosque. You can see the first shell land just to the right. And other targets were being engaged all over the place, right across this broad sweep where the PLO are dug in. The firing went on and on. The area around the mosque again being hit, and again you can see the shell landing, this time right in front. Then the ripping sound as a multi-barreled rocket launcher opened up on yet another target. It's this sort of pressure which has made the Lebanese Prime Minister, Mr. Al-Wazan, say that unless the Israelis lift their siege of Beirut, he will suspend all present negotiations which are going on to try and solve this problem peacefully. He's talked with the United States Special Envoy, Philip Habib, on the phone. He refuses to go through Israeli checkpoints to see him personally, and he believes there's still a basis for settlement, but not while this sort of thing goes on. While the Israelis fire their heavy weapons, the PLO are also under attack with small arms fire from the Christian phalangists. Like the Israelis, they too want the PLO to leave the Lebanon altogether. Their leader has accused the PLO of lying when they say they are prepared to leave, that they've done this just to gain more time to prepare their defenses. And for the first time, we've seen troop-carrying helicopters, another sign of Israeli dominance. And then the shells started to fall in West Beirut itself. So far, nothing's been said about an end to the ceasefire. And while a great deal has been heard about the PLO pulling out, there have been no signs that they are going to do so. The signs that can be seen show Israeli impatience and probably the start of their advance on West Beirut itself. Desmond Hamill, News at 10 on the outskirts of Beirut.
At the Gaza hospital near the Palestinian camps in West Beirut, they have had their fair share of misery. So they decided to have a party in an attempt to cheer themselves up. The party was organized by the PLO, who work closely with the Red Crescent Society, which administers the hospital. In the audience, doctors, nurses, patients, PLO fighters and their families, and at the back of the room, a little boy with a gun. The society's president, Yasser Arafat, Yasser Arafat's brother, joined in, dancing with a PLO guerrilla from abroad. There was a distinct element of propaganda about it, but it did brighten up the lives of a few. But somehow there is too much grief in Beirut for parties. It was as if they wanted desperately to enjoy themselves, but long since had forgotten how to do so. Sam Hall, News at 10 in West Beirut.
The Saudi and Syrian foreign ministers spent 1 hour and 10 minutes with President Reagan. Following the talks, US officials insisted that some progress had been made. It's believed that Mr. Reagan proposed an overall package of measures for the withdrawal of the Palestinian guerrillas. There's more work to be done on the plan. The timing of a reciprocal Israeli withdrawal and the location of a haven for the PLO members have yet to be agreed. The Saudi foreign minister expressed guarded optimism, but insisted that the main issue remained the independence and territorial integrity of the Lebanon.
Within that context, the primary concern is the withdrawal of the aggressor Israel. Within the decision of the Lebanese government and the Lebanese people for the withdrawal of Palestinians, whether from Beirut or from Lebanon, we have immediately now, without me putting any more clarity in this, a decision by the PLO themselves that they are willing to go.
Prince Saud is understood to have warned President Reagan that an Israeli occupation of West Beirut could have severe consequences for the United States. He's also thought to have pressed Mr. Reagan to recognize the Palestine Liberation Organization as a first step towards a peace settlement. There's evidence of growing sympathy within the Reagan administration for the Palestinians' plight. But the United States, with its ties to Israel, must plot a careful course, and talk of direct negotiations with the PLO may be somewhat premature. Andrew Mandelstam for News at 10, Washington.
Israeli warplanes flew high over Beirut again today, unseen but heard, bombing selected PLO positions. Military authorities say this is a follow-up to yesterday's action, which was retaliation to the breaking of the ceasefire. It also appears to be a continuation of Israeli policy to eliminate the PLO infrastructure in the Lebanon and particularly around Beirut. The action, which lasted about an hour and a half, was aimed primarily at tank and artillery positions. It's from positions like this one and others in the hills around the south of Beirut that the Israelis have been firing into the PLO camps around the city this afternoon. The commander of this lone tank, which moved its position from time to time, was very deliberate about the targets he selected. Artillery and tanks were firing from other positions, especially at targets around the airport. But at a much closer target, you can actually see the shell traveling to it across the bottom right-hand corner of the picture. The authorities here see today's shelling as another warning to the PLO that it is time for them to get out, and it's felt this sort of physical warning will continue. Desmond Hamill, News at 10 in the Lebanon. Israeli armor and artillery continue to pound away at PLO positions around Beirut today. This was all after Prime Minister Begin's government had given more time to Special Envoy Philip Habib to find a peaceful solution to this crisis. This is the 6th consecutive day now that this sort of firing has been going on. It followed a night of attacks on positions here and in West Beirut, which have been described as the heaviest so far of this war. Defense Minister Sharon has again said that Israeli fire is directed against clear and defined targets, military positions only. Philip Habib left Jerusalem to come back here to Beirut this afternoon, and it's believed he did ask the Prime Minister to ease this sort of military pressure. And while this might happen to some extent, no one expects Mr. Begin to call off the pressure altogether. Desmond Hamill, News at 10 in the Lebanon. All day, the noise of battle has thundered along this coastal strip as tons of explosives were hurled north towards Beirut. 8 weeks of this war have now come and gone, and the ceasefires come and go as well, on average about a week. Still, from their positions around Beirut, the Israelis are pounding the PLO positions. An incoming shell from the PLO landed close by, setting fire to the dry grass. But the smoke here was nothing like that over Beirut. Since dawn this morning, when the present round of firing started, a constant pall has drifted with the wind. Overhead, the Israeli warplanes on bombing runs, dropping anti-missile decoys. All this, the Israelis say, because the PLO broke the ceasefire. And also maybe because PLO leader Yasser Arafat has told his people to dig in and prepare even stronger defenses here. With a roar, the Katyushas are fired from multi-barreled rocket launchers. A strip of houses at El Uzai, where the PLO say they repulsed an attempted landing by the Israelis, came under fire from naval vessels lying offshore and out of sight. This was certainly the most intensive bombardment from the sea, the air, and from artillery that this city has suffered so far in this 2-month-old war. During the day, Israeli armor moved forward, gaining more ground from the PLO, and for the first time, pushing their front line north of the airport. By increasing the military pressure and coming up around the important PLO stronghold of Burj al-Barajani in a pincer movement, the Israelis hold the PLO in an even tighter grip than before, and by doing so may be pushing out of sight the possibility that diplomatic negotiations might bring a peaceful end to this conflict. Desmond Hamill, ITN, on the southern edge of Beirut.
At dawn, the Israelis attacked, pounding West Beirut from sea, land and air, wave after wave of fighter bombers. And this time we could see them dropping bombs of up to 1,000 pounds. The target, yet again, the ammunition dumps of the PLO in the southern suburbs of the city. It was the longest, the most concentrated, quite simply the most furious bombardment so far. 14 hours of constant shelling. And this time the Israeli army was coming in behind the Air Force. Out beyond the high-rises of the city center, by now covered in smoke and reeking of cordite, the Israelis and the Palestinians fought with tanks and artillery at Beirut airport. Tonight, part of the airport is in Israeli hands. The question is whether they will stop there, or whether we have seen today the beginning of a final push to drive the PLO out once and for all. Certainly it was ominous for the Palestinians that even in mid-afternoon, after hours of this, the Israelis were coming in overhead with impunity, showing scant regard for anti-aircraft fire. All in all, the strongest reminder yet, if the PLO and the people of West Beirut needed any, that Israeli patience with negotiations is exhausted. Tonight there is a ceasefire and the city is quiet, but the hope of peace looks very thin indeed. David Smith, ITN, inside West Beirut.
For the people of Lebanon, the price is high. Squalor, a swelling number of refugees, and suffering on a massive scale. All these hunger strikers can do now is to protest feebly to whoever will listen.
The PLO's front line is a maze of trenches and tunnels. For thousands of men, a way of life underground. Survival depending on a combination of alertness and silence. They know they don't have the military hardware to hold off the Israelis. Their only advantage is a well-fortified position. Once every 2 days, the men come out of the front line. A chance to rest about 200 yards back towards town. Water, even soap, may be running short in West Beirut, but it isn't here. Supply lines to meet almost every need are working. More importantly, we found a strong sense of discipline among these men, even among the youngest, boys of just 16 and 17. A discipline that had every one of them telling us that they will leave West Beirut if their leader, Yasser Arafat, tells them to do so. But no matter what happens, they firmly believe their cause will never die.
If Israel tries to destroy all the buildings, it will find under one stone will get up a fight, a soldier to destroy Israel. Here.
As he spoke, they were digging a grave about 100 yards back from the front line. Like the vast majority of the victims in this war, a civilian, 22 years old, caught in sniper fire. At the edge of the graveyard, his mother waited, alone, for the burial. David Smith, ITN, West Beirut.
The Israeli aerial bombardment began last night. Wave after wave of bombers came in under cover of darkness, striking at targets in the center of Beirut. At dawn, Israeli jets could still be seen screaming across the sky. The raids lasted for more than 10 hours, the heaviest concentration of air attacks since the war began. The bombing was accompanied by fierce tank and artillery exchanges, and high-rise buildings in the center of the city suffered hit after hit. Infantry were also engaged in close combat. An ITN crew watched as Israeli troops flushed out Palestinian snipers firing at their positions. Rifle exchanges were replaced by a round from a rocket-propelled grenade. The Palestinian position was engulfed in flames. Today's attack on Beirut outraged many Israelis already uneasy about civilian casualties. And Prime Minister Begin, at a parliamentary session to discuss the war, found himself the subject of extraordinary criticism. 2 communist MPs were forcibly evicted from the chamber for refusing to keep order, but not before they'd asked the question other people are asking here. With a peace settlement in sight, why was Israel still bombing and shelling Beirut? "You're murderers and butchers," this MP shouted at the government benches. "You do not want to hear the truth." Other MPs were not as noisy, but just as insistent. The spokesman for the opposition Labour Party, General Bar-Lev, said that while military pressure could help dislodge the PLO, it was nothing compared to the damage inflicted on Israel's own conscience. Mr. Begin was unrepentant. He could not deny innocent civilians were being killed, but he insisted Israeli forces had been given orders to attack only recognized military positions held by the PLO. Defense Minister Sharon, the architect of Israel's hardline military stance, watched as Mr. Begin dismissed his hecklers and insisted that Israel was not responsible for ceasefire violations. Mr. Begin has always believed that only continuous military pressure will force the PLO out of Beirut. But in the aftermath of this debate, and with a breakdown of the negotiations threatened by the bombardment of the city, Mr. Begin bowed to pressure from his cabinet and President Reagan and ordered the 11th Israeli ceasefire. Norman Rees, News at 10 in Jerusalem.
As a sign of good intent, the PLO have been moving off the streets of West Beirut in the past 24 hours as they get ready to go. In their place have come the Murabitun, a Muslim left-wing militia that dates back to the Lebanese civil war of the 70s, heavily armed with Russian tanks and anti-aircraft guns. Their presence is a stark reminder that even when the PLO go, Lebanon could still be left with its own internal wars. Because this small army is ready to face the Christians of the right, the Phalange, who are dug in with the Israelis on the other side of Beirut. It was significant that this morning, as the Israelis pulled back a few hundred yards in East Beirut, it wasn't the Lebanese army that moved into this, the museum crossing point, but the Murabitun. With precise plans from the PLO, they started clearing dozens of land and anti-personnel mines, laid by the Palestinians to meet an Israeli push across this line. An extensive network of booby-trap devices put down just a few weeks ago. And when they'd finished that, they brought in bulldozers to remove the sandbags from the bunkers and dugouts of the PLO. The clearest sign yet that this war is all but over, that the Palestinians are going, and soon. But a sign, too, that they'll be replaced on the front line by another fighting force, with an enemy just a few hundred yards away across a city that, even with the PLO out, could still be as divided as ever. David Smith, News at 10, in West Beirut.
Fadi Al-Haf is 19, a member of the hardcore group Al-Fatah. He joined at age 13. For the past 10 weeks, he's been on the front line. He has no passport, no identity card. But if all goes well, he'll soon be leaving for exile in Tunisia. His rifle, the only possession he values enough to take with him. He was born and brought up here in the Palestinian camp of Borj Barajni, a son of refugees from Haifa, once in Palestine, now in Israel. Like many of the PLO, he's single, and like most, he'll be leaving family behind. Home is a ground floor flat for mother, father, and 7 younger brothers. He broke the news to them a few days ago. His mother is still stunned by the sudden breakup of her family. His father, though, accepts it all with the fatalism that is shared by every Palestinian.
This is my boy.
We would like to go with him, but we, his mother and I, will die here apart from him.
Nevertheless, we share his cause, because it is the cause of a people, the Palestinian people, who will one day all be slaughtered, because that is our destiny. I am going with all my friends, with almost everyone I know. I take comfort in that, because we have only one way out, and that is to leave West Beirut. The idea is for wives and children of PLO men to join them later. Parents, brothers and sisters will not be going. As a result, the Al-Hafs admit they probably won't see Fadi again. The departure of the Palestinian fighters will mean that to thousands of such families. David Smith, News at 10, West Beirut. Lebanon, and Beirut in particular, has been home for the PLO since 1970, when they were expelled from Jordan. Now they walk these streets with the ease of those who've been accepted as a fact of life by the people of this city and country. Never more so than today, as they bought up the necessities for their impending departure to the Arab states which are taking them in. But in the past 12 years, the PLO has had more than just a home here in Lebanon. They've run the affairs of the 700,000 Palestinians living in this country almost like a government. In effect, the Lebanese have allowed the PLO to build a state within a state. It's an organization which, for example, has its own radio station, The Voice of Palestine, broadcasting the latest news to the men on the front line. Not once has this station gone off the air in the months of this siege. An organization that has as well a civilian defense force outside the military. In the past few weeks, it is mainly they who've moved in the bulldozers to clear the rubble from Israeli attacks. And they who've been responsible for finding and taking care of survivors. All of them ferried off in ambulances belonging to the Palestinian Red Crescent, part of the PLO network, and taken to hospitals which are run by the PLO for their own people. Behind the sandbags of this, the Gaza hospital near the airport, treatment has been remarkably good in the circumstances. Nevertheless, hospitals have been hit. Some of them have closed. It will take years to get back to the standards of healthcare the PLO once had. The same is true of education. This is one of half a dozen PLO schools which has been bombed. Here, children from Palestinian refugee camps were educated, in many cases a preparation for life in the PLO itself. Now this school will not reopen until the new year, if at all. As they get ready to go, the PLO are confident about rebuilding their army elsewhere. But it's unlikely that Syria, Iraq or any of the other Arab countries will ever allow them to build the kind of setup they had here. An organization PLO leaders once said was capable of taking care of every Palestinian from cradle to grave. David Smith, News at 1, West Beirut. Today the PLO was still buried in all along a front line that stretches for miles around a city that is no longer at war, but now waits for the evacuation of the Palestinians. These are the men who will stay to the last, protecting every position while others pull out behind them. It was a sign of just how suspicious they still are that they were moving men up to the front. Nevertheless, the mood is one of cautious optimism. They believe this evacuation is going to work, and the vast majority of them are ready to go. But there's no talk of surrender here, only of moving their army on to other countries to build new bases for themselves. The agreement will allow them to take their personal weapons with them, rifles, pistols and ammunition. But it is only when these last evacuees pull out in a couple of weeks that the heavy weapons will be handed over to the Lebanese. The tanks, for example, which are still in position and will remain so until it's clear this agreement has succeeded. Early tomorrow, the French paratroopers of the multinational force are due to arrive here at the port, where the Israelis and the PLO stand just 300 yards from each other. They will seal off this area, standing between the two as a buffer. After 76 days of war and the loss of thousands of lives, there is an agreement. Yet no one's actually signed a peace settlement. Neither sides recognize the other. The fact is that while the PLO may leave this city quietly, their war will go on. David Smith, News at 10, in West Beirut. The French had arrived at first light, 350 paratroopers, many from the Foreign Legion, here to stand between the Israelis and the PLO until this evacuation is over. They found the Israelis waiting for them on the quayside, where they'd been told the Lebanese army would be. An inauspicious start for the multinational force as they unloaded men, trucks, supplies and weapons. The French commanders presented their plan to the Israelis. Apparently the Lebanese had been rather nervous about the idea of moving the Israelis out themselves. Eventually, the Lebanese turned up to get a ticking off from the French, who wanted the Israelis out right away. So the Israelis, who took this port area a few weeks ago after some of the heaviest fighting in this war, finally pulled back to allow the French to take over. By mid-morning, the paratroopers were moving into position to seal off the port for the evacuation, taking up the very bunkers the Israelis had held. In the center of West Beirut, the first evacuees had been gathering in a football stadium from early morning. The PLO had been under pressure to show good intent by sending some of their fighters today, and not just the wounded, as originally planned. They obliged by having a battalion of about 400 move out, all of them in full battle dress, carrying personal weapons, including rocket-propelled grenades, which the Israelis say the agreement does not allow them to take. Goodbyes between those leaving and those staying here until next week, when the bulk of the Palestinians will go. There were wives, daughters, sisters and brothers as well, all of them standing by. They will not be joining their men for several months, if at all. For some, home will still be Beirut. From here they moved off for the 3-mile journey down to the port, most of them bound first for Cyprus, then on to Jordan and Iraq. The beginning of an evacuation that will leave about 7,000 men scattered over half a dozen Arab countries, but with the hardcore likely to end up in Syria, still on Israel's front line. Which is why perhaps this departure became something of a celebration, with the PLO going out, guns blazing. It up every step of the way down to the harbour. There the French force stood by, nervous but getting a Palestinian welcome. At last, this evacuation was underway.
If this was a sad day for Yasser Arafat, he wasn't going to let it show. Before leaving, he went to say his farewells to his most valued friends, and the people of West Beirut came to say goodbye to him. The first call was on Walid Jumblat, the leader of the left-wing Muslims in Beirut who've supported him since he brought the PLO headquarters to the city in 1970. Mr. Arafat declared that the Siege of Beirut had brought about a new dawn on the Arab scene and a united resistance against the Israelis. There was another enthusiastic reception at the office of the Lebanese Prime Minister, Shafiq al-Wazan, who played a key part in the ceasefire and evacuation negotiations. At the port, the PLO had prepared a guard of honor and short ceremony to see their chairman off. Some more of their colleagues were going too, but when Mr. Arafat's motorcade arrived, all thought of ceremony was forgotten as his supporters surged forward. The man who'd helped found the PLO in 1964 and been its chairman ever since had not lost any of his popularity. Indeed, his friends say the Battle of Beirut had greatly increased his standing. His reputation and authority is certainly intact around the Arab world. But Lebanese troops were needed to stop his own men mobbing him all the way to the ship. He boarded the Greek vessel Atlantis bound for Athens, where he's expected to stay for a few days only. Then he will go on to Tunisia, where many of his fighters are already, and where he'll establish his new political headquarters. Jeremy Hands, ITN, West Beirut.